Are beneficiaries of an inheritance subject to taxation? It's a great question, one we get often, and I think there's a few different things to talk about related to this, and the ultimate answer is it depends. So let's take a look at it. All right, so I said there's multiple factors to look at related to this question of whether or not a beneficiary of an inheritance is going to be subject to taxation. And I think the first thing to talk about is income tax. Now, on the federal level, well, there's two things to look at related to each one of these different factors. The federal tax treatment as well as the state tax treatment. So on the federal level, there is no income taxation on an inheritance. So if you receive an inheritance, it's free of income tax. The IRS is not going to levy anything against you. That's great news, right? And so on the state level, to my knowledge, there isn't any state that does have an income tax on an inheritance that you receive. Now, I could be wrong about that one because I'm not up to date on all 50 states' income taxation, but to my knowledge, there isn't one. Point is, you should look at the state that you live in and determine whether or not that is a factor, but I don't think it is. The next thing to look at is the estate tax. So if you've watched my videos before, you know I talk a lot about estate tax strategies. One of the things to keep in mind is the estate tax is always it's kind of a moving target. So right now in 2025, an individual can pass up to $13.99 million in assets during their lifetime and upon their passing. So it's a lifetime exemption or a lifetime transfer, wealth transfer tax. So they're able to pass up to $13.99 million in assets free of any estate tax. Anything over that threshold is going to be subject to the estate tax. There are a few states that do have an estate tax, so that's something to look at. I know Minnesota has one. There's a few other states that have them as well. I'm more familiar with Minnesota's, and it's much lower. I don't remember if it's 2 or 3 million, but I think it's around there somewhere. But it's lower than the federal estate tax exemption. So that's something to look at and something to consider as well. But here's an important nuance to this. I said it's an estate tax. So it's not the individual beneficiary or beneficiaries that are going to be subject to the estate tax. It's the estate. So during a person's lifetime, they are their own legal entity. They have their own taxation number, their own tax ID number, which is usually their social security number. When they pass away, what's left behind is their estate, and that is the legal entity, and it has its own tax ID number as well. It's the estate that's responsible for paying the estate tax. So it's not going to be up to the individual beneficiaries to pay off the estate tax. So that's good news for the beneficiaries. It's bad news for the estate if there is an estate tax that's going to be assessed, because it will minimize the estate that ultimately goes to the beneficiaries. All right, so the last piece of this entire puzzle is the inheritance tax. And I saved this for last because it is the issue related to beneficiaries receiving an inheritance. So some states, well, let me start with the federal piece first. There is no federal inheritance tax. So the IRS is not going to assess an inheritance tax against individuals who receive an inheritance. The inheritance tax can be assessed at the state level. There are certain states, a minority of states, that do have an inheritance tax. But again, the estate is not responsible for the inheritance tax. It's the beneficiary who receives the inheritance that's going to be subject to the inheritance tax. I'm licensed in 2 states that have an inheritance tax, Pennsylvania and Kentucky. I probably have done the most work with Pennsylvania's inheritance tax. So kind of just to give you a background on how that works, Pennsylvania does not assess an inheritance tax when you, as a spouse. So if spouses pass assets to one another as an inheritance, that surviving spouse is not subject to an inheritance tax. They're not responsible for having to come up with the money to pay off the tax. From there, though, it could be a cousin, a nephew, a niece, aunt, uncle. It could be your own children that you're leaving an inheritance to, and there could be an inheritance tax assessed against them. In Pennsylvania, if you leave an inheritance to a child, that child is responsible for paying taxes on that inheritance. And so it's up to them to come up with the resources or the cash to be able to pay off this inheritance tax. And they can use the inheritance itself, whether they have to liquidate it or maybe the inheritance is cash. They can use the inheritance to pay off the inheritance tax. The disadvantage of that is that it is reducing the inheritance that they receive. The other option is they just pay it out of their pocket from the other assets that they have. Not a great solution either way. Ultimately, there could be a tax levied against beneficiaries of an inheritance. It's not going to be income tax. It's not going to be estate tax, but it could be inheritance tax. So look out for inheritance tax.